Friday afternoon, everyone. I'm Zach Keeney, joined by Matthew Fish, and we welcome you all to another MSP Cyber Roundtable. If you haven't already, make sure you check out last week's webinar on YouTube. We had James Abercrombie on from Acronis to talk about disaster recovery planning. If you're new to the roundtable this week, make sure you check out our educational video library on YouTube and like us on LinkedIn. Today we have Teddy and Michael from Shield on to discuss the difference between vulnerability management and penetration testing. We'll do full introductions in a moment, but first, how's everybody doing today? Not everybody all at once, good Lord.
I'm still distracted by the backgrounds. So
yeah,
I already know the answer. No one say. So I want the audience to chip in here at some point. We'll tell everyone the answer. Who is left and right of who? They're Teddy and Michael are in meat space
We're
together.
in the same room, yeah.
A little shell game going on.
You got to watch the clouds for the next 5 minutes.
Oh yeah. If you get a plane, there's an airport right behind us. You'll get a plane going from my one to Michael's. So.
Okay. And you guys are in Indiana, right? Or am I?
Yeah, Indianapolis.
Indianapolis,
yeah.
Big Colts fans?
Michael.
That's an appropriate
big
answer.
Colts fan. Yeah, no, we
it's a bit of a rebuild we got going on.
We've had better years, better decades, but they're doing all right. They're doing
Definitely.
Well, how are the Browns, Zach?
Well, I'm a big Steelers fan, thank God. I do live in Ohio, so I get to giggle at them. They're doing good, I think. They're doing okay.
All right, quick intros, right?
Let's do it.
Let's do it.
All right. I'll go first. Matt Fish, founder of Fort Mesa. I help service providers, MSPs, MSSPs, own their client cybersecurity roadmap, governance, risk compliance, a little bit of vulnerability management. Been in this MSP segment a long time. Teddy, Michael, Zach, you're up.
Zach, you want to go ahead and keep it with the Fort Mesa train?
Sure, yeah. Zach Keeney, co-founder and director of channel sales with Fort Mesa. Grew up in the Domino's Pizza executive development ecosystem and ultimately owned my own franchise for a few years where I worked with MSPs and contracted MSPs. And then got excited about the future of the intersection between technology and government. I think we're going to need some good people there. So sold my stores and pursuing a master's degree in computer science with an emphasis on governance, risk, and compliance. And happily joined up with Matt to help guys execute compliance in the space.
Nice. Yeah. So if anyone has done a demo with us or an intro call or anything like that, you'll know that we make this joke, but Michael and I have pretty much the exact same background. Very similar. Went to the same high school, same college, same first job out of school, started a company together, started another company together. But so yeah, Teddy Guzek, co-founder and CEO of Shield Cyber. Background is in entirely penetration testing. So the last penetration testing, vulnerability management, mostly offensive security type of stuff. The last decade, that's basically been everything that's been tailored to. I worked at a large consulting firm up in Chicago, where I traveled the globe and kind of did pen tests for Fortune 500 companies. Wanted to move back home to Indianapolis, start my own thing. So I started a penetration testing company there, or here rather. Michael came on board about 6 months later, and the rest is history. So we have about a dozen person pen test shop here in Indianapolis that sits in the hallway across from us here, and that's all they do day in and day out. And then about 2 years ago, we were on a flight to San Francisco and decided that we wanted to create something for the SMB, for managed service providers and such. So there's more story behind that, but yeah, that's kind of our background. Mike, I'll kick it to you to say ditto to that. And
he's gonna have to fill in the Mad Lib, man. I want to know what the high school was, what the first job was, what your guys' favorite hot dog options are.
you really did steal my thunder there, because I have one joke and one joke only, and it's literally like me not having to repeat myself after Teddy just intros my entire background for myself. But yeah, I went to, out of college, Teddy hired me up in Chicago. We worked at Protivity, got real good experience up in their penetration testing lab. When COVID hit, Teddy had started Hoplite Consulting, which is the pen test company he was referring to, convinced me to come down, join him, grow that company, and that company is still alive today. So we created that pen testing firm, and like Teddy mentioned earlier, 2 years ago, we had an idea to create a product. So like Teddy, my background is completely in technical security assessments. I specialize in performing, pretty in-depth red team operations, network penetration tests, so external, internal penetration tests. Have some experience with web application and building out web application security programs as well.
You guys obviously were thinking about the Roman Empire before everybody started making the joke about all the guys thinking about the Roman Empire.
That's right.
You were like way ahead. You're the guys that everybody's on TikTok about.
Oh yeah. My wife asked that question, and she was very disappointed by my response, which was 8th grade. I think that's the last time I thought about the Roman Empire.
I mean, if you just think about the office.
And Shield.
Yeah, that's true. That's true.
You don't even know you're thinking about it.
That was more of a synonyms game type of thing. Like, what's creative around like defend or protect, and shield is kind of a spin-off of that too, as well. But yeah.
All right, guys, we're gonna do our moment of educational wonder here before we get into the discussion of the day. So with that, let's take a quick moment. So before we get into the larger discussion, today we're just going to do a quick review on CIS Controls version 8, domain 18, or control 18, penetration testing. Now, this is the last of 18 control categories in their Center for Internet Security's control matrix. What that means is, for just about any organization, they recommend doing penetration testing last. Contrary to some people's perceptions, that actually makes a whole lot of sense, because first you build all of the security and then you test all the security and see what you missed. There's a public perception out there, which we'll get into a little later, that the way you should design a security program is by doing penetration testing, which will help you find all your holes and then patch them. But that is the most expensive way possible to build a security program, and it will take the longest. You will need to penetration test over and over and over to build a security program that way, and that's why we test at the end. So in any case, real quick, subcontrols 18.1 through 18.5, I'm going to just talk for a moment about each of these just to orient everyone around penetration testing. But before I dive in, one note here. The Center for Internet Security Controls are split up into what they call implementation groups. Implementation groups 1, 2, and 3. And in implementation group 1, which is for small businesses that are using off-the-shelf software, they don't have any regulated data. Impacts to those small business systems can't impact human safety. The Center for Internet Security says don't do penetration testing for multiple reasons. The why doesn't matter very much at the moment, but the guidance here is small businesses, if they don't have specialized systems, they're using off-the-shelf systems, they don't have regulated data, they can't impact human safety, put your money elsewhere. Everyone else, you should be doing penetration testing of some type. So if you have custom business applications, you have regulated data of some type, you should be in implementation group 2. If you're a very large or complex organization, or you have highly regulated data, or there's a clear link between system safety and human safety, you should be in implementation group 3, which means you're going to do a couple of extra penetration testing steps. But starting with the implementation group 2, 18.1, establish your penetration testing program. So write it down, write what your plan is, create your plan, execute your plan. Hopefully your plan says something like, we do penetration tests of this type. We do them on a certain type of cadence. Here are the people that are going to be involved. Here are the goals. That's the kind of thing that goes into a testing plan. And then the program comes when you actually enact that plan and execute on it. If your plan only exists in a binder, on a piece of paper, that is not a testing program. That's just a piece of paper. So it's 18.1. Put the program in place and execute it. What should be in that program? At the very least, you should be doing external penetration tests. That's 18.2. That is, look at the outside of an organization. These days, we're getting pretty creative about what external and internal means, but traditionally, this would mean like scanning a network surface, maybe looking at some email servers, looking at a website, that kind of thing. That's something that can be partially automated, and it should be periodic. 18.3, remediate your pen test findings. So do something about it. I think when most people think about penetration testing, they think about these automated scans, scan from the outside and then do something about it. And the thing here, there's really a narrow set of organizations where that exact methodology makes sense. Because remember, small businesses, this isn't recommended at all. In the most regulated environments, you need to go a little bit further. So this does make sense for a lot of organizations. But again, the inside and outside definitions are getting flipped these days. We've got these zero trust architectures. We've got post-COVID work from home. We've got bring your own devices crawling into company networks. External and internal are rather mixed up these days. 18.4, and this is the first of the 2 measures that the Center for Internet Security recommends for those comprehensive security penetration tests. Validate your security measures. And what they mean by this is that your penetration testing should be testing the exact things that you already have formalized that are your security. So if you look at the CIS control framework for all the guidance you're supposed to be doing in security, and you're looking at domains 1 through 17, you should be testing all the things in all 17 categories. And that's a lot more comprehensive than clicking a scan button from the outside. It does require engaging a services organization that can study your security plan, even figure out how to create the tests for all those controls, which they may not even know they may have to create, right? They may not have a pre-cooked playbook for that. A lot of organizations do this in-house. They've got, a larger organization will actually have a little unit that will do this, and they will test those security measures on an ongoing basis. And then there's periodic internal penetration tests. So not just scan from the outside in an automated way, but make sure you've got sensors deployed inside your network to shine lights in all of the dark holes, which is not as simple as just showing up and scanning the inside of the network, because if you've built your network correctly and you followed all of the guidance in CIS 1 through 17, that won't even be possible. So you do need to figure out how to even get the scanners in all of the places where you can gather all those results. So anyway, that's CIS 18.1 through 5. There are much deeper holes you can go into in penetration testing, red teaming, etc. CIS stays at the very lowest common denominator, highest amount of security value for the lowest amount of resource investment, and that's what we're looking at today. So with that, guys, we've oriented our audience here on what's penetration testing. We didn't go over vulnerability management today, but I think I have the penetration testing versus vulnerability management discussion with a handful of people every single week, and it's changed over time. I think there was a period of time when vulnerability management was frankly pretty weak. because you scan a network and you have a bazillion results, and what do you do about it? If you got 30,000 vulnerabilities and 15,000 of them are high, how do you focus? I think in the last couple of years, the tools to make that process much easier and more focused has made vulnerability management a lot more powerful. On the other side, penetration testing, people for a long time used to sell those simple vulnerability scans as a penetration test. With it, technically, it's a type of penetration test, right?
Still do.
It's an enumerative penetration test, right? But penetration testing is like a category, and there's different types of things in that category. And when you use the word penetration test, you should be looking at probably multiple tools in that toolbox. But for years, there's been products out there that have increasingly automated this, but they're button pusher platforms, right? And I don't know if the penetration test label is any more valid for those than the vulnerability scan, right? Where it's looking at a piece of the puzzle and there's not humans involved. But you guys have that little OSCP label on your name. What's going on here in the market right now? These definitions are changing every day.
Yeah, a lot of thoughts. Some that Michael and I go over on a daily basis. Kind of to set the stage, though, the way that I usually explain it to people, and the difference in the two of them is with the analogy of the vulnerability management is it's like health, right? It's like taking care of yourself, working out, eating well, taking time away from work and things like that, right? So those are things you're doing on a daily basis, right? So you're scanning, you're patching, you're fixing things. But once a year, right, you go to the doctor, right? And you go to that doctor and they take a deeper look in. What's going on? Is there anything that you could have missed, right? Because the truth about pen testing too is that you can do everything in vulnerability management well, traditional vulnerability management well, and people and attackers can still get in. So there's a lot of different definitions for it, and it has changed over the years. I think people are starting to get a better idea that what a manual pen test is actually, an objective driven exercise to gain access to a certain system or certain types of data, rather than just scanning for vulnerabilities and potentially exploiting those things and calling that a pen test. I'll stop there and kind of just kick it over to Mike. But yeah, I've all sorts of thoughts on this.
Yeah, no, I agree completely, Teddy. And back to Matt, when you were going over the CIS control, it is really building up those security controls. And then once a year or however frequent you want to test those things, you do a point in time exercise to really validate that those controls are in place. When it comes down to, automated means of pen testing or scanning versus what is the difference between with an actual human behind the keyboard. One of the first things that I'll try and explain to a client or someone looking to do a pen test is try and break down their attack surface. So I think you were alluding to this again, Matt, when you were going through the CIS control. With how decentralized everything is, a lot of organizations have, third-party applications that host critical information. They have cloud resources all over the place. They have user VPN logins to their VPN portals to their physical network. They have, cloud-based access portals, right? So breaking those things down, outlining and helping organizations understand their attack surface, where their weaknesses could lie, is really kind of the value that goes beyond just doing something from an automated means. So it's like, when I'm an external threat and I'm an external pen tester, I'm going to look for all information that I could use to, build my way up, to build an attack, to try and get more information, get into more systems, or get into their physical network or physical systems, right? So I think that's where a lot of the difference lines or plays out when you have an actual human behind the keyboard. You can look for more things. If you've got your attack surface buttoned up, or you're confident that these are the ways all of my users can get in. Good for
All
you.
right, so we got two offensive security certified experts here on the call,
Sure.
and I don't want to vendor bash, so we're not going to use names, okay? But there are products out there that say penetration testing on the tin, right? And then they say continuous automated. So without going into the capabilities, some of which are quite sophisticated and pretty neat, actually. Some of them can look through firewall rules and they can map attack surfaces. They can even do threat modeling. Is penetration test an appropriate label? Or I feel like for years in my security practice, I avoided the penetration test label entirely because it doesn't mean anything specific to people, and instead have been relying on more technical definitions of what's scoped, what the requirements are and what's scoped, because I'm so afraid of that label. It to me doesn't have a very consistent meaning. And I hear you describing it, but then I'm thinking about these products. I'm like, I don't know, is that a fair label?
Yeah, no, that's a good point. So with penetration testing, right? The idea is two test controls. Don't look at penetration testing as the same as like a vulnerability management, continuous scanning. The value is not going to be there. The point of the pen testing is to do all of your things beforehand and make sure those things are secure, and then you go test that thing, and so or test those controls. The main thing is like, and I'm losing my train of thought here, but I had something that was, scope is the most important part of a pen test, right? So are those continuous, and they may be doing, right? If it's a service that's continuously looking at your attack surface and testing different things, maybe this week they're testing the apps, next week they're testing the external network, next week they're testing the internal
It's
network.
usually a short list, right? It's whatever was easy to automate.
Right. So it's probably an internal pen test, right? So and that's fine. That's very valid. It's a good thing to test, and it's definitely serving a purpose. But it's just something to know that you don't want to think that is going to cover everything, right? Because the first part in Mike, one thing you were saying earlier that I wanted to hit on was, when you're doing the first and most important part of a pen test is a scoping exercise, right? Before you even present a quote or anything like that, if someone gives you a quote after asking you two questions, like, it's probably not going to be the best pen test. They should be working with you as an advisor to try to understand what your attack surface looks like and be able to give you recommendations on scopes to follow, right? And then prioritizing those recommendations beforehand as far as what we're going to test. So if it's, if someone just asks you, gives you a questionnaire, and they say, give me your external IP addresses, and then we'll test it, that's an external pen test, then, sure, if it's a check the box exercise, that's fine. But it's not going to be a true testament of your entire attack surface and trying to get in, if that makes sense. I kind of went off a tangent there, but.
Well, yeah, I mean, this is a subject all of our listeners and viewers get lost in, right? And it starts when you're running through a questionnaire related to maybe a security framework, or you're filling out an insurance application, or the one I see most commonly is something a lawyer wrote, and that's either in a contract or a law, right? It's not necessarily the part of the law that's legislative. Sometimes it's a legislative rule, right?
Yep.
Some kind of rulemaking process where they write in the word penetration testing. And people all over the world are guilty of this, lawyers, right? Because it's the layman term, right? But then as a security professional, you have to try to translate lawyerese into an actual executive act, right?
Yeah.
And the customer comes to the security professional and says, I need a penetration test because it said that on a piece of paper, and maybe the customer's ready for that penetration test, and maybe they're not. But I think that's the trouble, right? Translating. How do you take that law, that random two-word statement, penetration test, that was written by someone that doesn't really know the definition? And it's a vague definition, right? Because penetration test is not actually a technical term, right? It describes a category of, like, it's the spirit of the act, right? If you want to get technical, you have to describe, you have to scope it, right? Exactly what's happening. So how do you translate that? How do people know when they're actually doing the right thing or the wrong thing when all they're trying to do is satisfy that requirement?
Mike, you want to take that? Yeah.
Well, I think it really just depends on the organization's goals, and are they trying to check that box, or are they trying to improve their security controls? You know, from the first 5 minutes in talking to a client if it's one or the other, I think. You know, it
Well,
really,
for me, Mike, I just want to, like, I know you guys did pen testing as a business for a while, so you guys may have a certain client base bias, but I will tell you, I'm out there just bumping into random businesses, random service providers with a really big diversity 9 out of 10 times, and that might be generous because it might be more like 19 out of 20. It's because there's a requirement that says pen test someplace. It's not because they're trying to build security, because if they were trying to build security, they would have crawled up from zero, built all the security, had a mature framework, and said to themselves, "Oh, we're ready for a pen test," and they wouldn't need to ask for it. They'd be on it already, right?
Yeah.
It's not usually that, right? It's usually I'm trying to figure out how to satisfy this requirement, and I think what I'm hearing is there's no one right answer. It really depends on a lot of factors. So what are those factors?
I mean,
Go ahead, Mike.
I think all the factors just go back to scope. And I think the best question you can talk or ask an organization when starting this process is, what are you concerned about? Like, what is your concern? And this is after, what's the reason for the pen test? If it's compliance, if it's, you want to get better on a, security control standpoint, understood. But that next question is, what are your biggest concerns? What are you hosting from, a system information standpoint? And that's kind of how we think through the best way to kind of start a penetration test, scope a penetration test, is just think through those things with our clients. What keeps you up at night?
We got a question here. So here's the question. Should small banks be doing pen testing? Now, I happen to know a little bit about FDIC regulations, so that might be cheating. But it's regulated data, right? It's regulated data, and the regulator, the FDIC, they want you to do the real deal, right? And in fact, they're going to come in and do it for you. So you should be doing pen testing. Certainly, if you don't want to lose your license, because you will, I believe that the requirements are different at different levels of assets, but they will take your license, they will shut you down, and if your security is not fixable very quickly, you're not getting that license back. You're selling your assets. So I would say yes, you have to be doing them. But what's an appropriate pen test for a bank to be doing, and what should they be doing before the regulator arrives versus when the regulator's there? What should they expect?
I would say, so at a minimum, a lot of those banks are probably going to be using some sort of off-the-shelf software that's not custom built, right? That someone else is likely maintaining. If not, those applications that if it's a self, created application, or there's any sort of custom code to it at all, that's step one, is definitely taking a look at that app. Now, the problem is a lot of those regulators they don't really understand what the definition of pen testing is either, or really rather what these organizations should be doing. So an external scan pen test will suffice, and that's fine. For them, they're going to see, okay, they ran a scan. The results look like you have 3 low SSL vulnerabilities, and okay, cool. And it looks like you guys addressed those things, so no big deal. Where there's a lot more that goes into those to a real test than that, infrastructure or a web app side. And so that's also a stipulation to make too, is that an external pen test is usually referring to external infrastructure. It's not layer 7. It's not doing a web application pen test as well. So if you're going to someone and you're saying, hey, can you do this external pen test for me? Don't assume that they're doing an in-depth pen test on your apps. That's usually a separate scoping item. But that's where you find a lot of the flaws, is in custom code. And that's how people get in externally a lot. For the most part, people's external assets, they're external IPs. The infrastructure is pretty locked down. Like,
Yeah, and I've worked for a few banks over the years, and they typically don't write their own banking course.
Yeah.
And they usually don't run their own ATMs, right? But they tend to have programmers or custom code that was lifted off the shops of independent programmers for things like reporting, data interfaces, um, probably a whole lot of things I'm not mentioning right now. But even a very small bank would probably have that custom code. So, um, you know, so now we're like edging on: should we be doing threat modeling? Should that be going at the organizational level? Should that be going down into the source code, right? Which is where you actually, that's a theoretical exercise, right? Is that something you'd normally classify as part of a pen test, or could that be scoped as part of a pen test, or is that usually a separate?
Yeah, I'm really glad you asked that. Mike loves the threat modeling question, but that should be a part of your scoping. You should be talking about like, what does your attack surface look like? And Mike can go into more about the questions and stuff like that we ask, but it's important to understand what that looks like so that you're testing the right things.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, if again, it is all about scope. If you're worried about your cloud resources or ways into your internal infrastructure through VPNs or other infrastructure you have externally hosted, those are all things that I would recommend looking at first.
So we talked about pen testing a bunch. The definition's blurry. It's focused on testing systems, right? Both, and I'm not just talking about systems like computer systems, right? Organizational systems, security operating systems, people process systems, right? We're testing whether the systems that are trying to keep us safe are working the way they're supposed to, right?
Is there a SOC? Is the SOC responding properly? Is there, yeah.
Yeah. What happens when we poke the bear? Do they wake up? Like, right? What about vulnerability management? Where's the exact line there? Because there's certainly they're related, right? There's like a Venn overlap in these things. So
yeah.
I mean, for anyone that doesn't know, there's this data format out there called OVAL, right? Which is like it's developed by NIST, and a lot of companies out there publish this OVAL data, which has both configuration mistakes in it, but also basically software versions and things in software that could identify that software may be vulnerable. And then these things get packaged up into databases with checks, sort of like antivirus signatures, right? And they get packaged up with usually what's called an SCAP scanner, right? And the scanner is just the engine. You stick the OVAL data in it, it scans systems, and then it spits out vulnerabilities, right? And that's more technical than probably anyone who's ever paid for vulnerability management or penetration testing has ever gotten. But that's the guts of what's happening in the machine. And basically, it's the same for every type of vulnerability scanner out there. There's a big difference, though, in terms of the effectiveness of the agents and the quality of the data feed. But after you have that data, you find a list of holes, a list of problems. And how do you think how would you describe that being quantitatively different or qualitatively different than the types of things you find in a penetration test, and why is that useful? And I think you mentioned early on that should be happening continuously, so tell us why.
Yeah, so vulnerability management, think of it as like, scanning continuously, but then like pen testing can be like fall under a vulnerability management program, right? Like it's anything that could manage vulnerabilities. Like the results from a pen test would go into like, the person that manages vulnerability management would likely be the one that's reviewing those results. But it's consistently scanning an environment at an interval, right? And it's not like once a quarter where you get a static set of results that, oh, here's our Excel spreadsheet of all the findings that this third party did. If that's what you're getting, you need to think a little bit more about continuously managing vulnerabilities. You need to have like statistics and dashboards and KPIs and things like that. That's when you're starting to get into the difference between like a vulnerability scan or interval scans and vulnerability management. And the key to vulnerability management too is think past patch management. Everyone thinks vulnerability management is like, okay, missing patches for Apache or an operating system. There's a lot of configurations that are misconfigured that falls under that realm as well. Because yes, people say, oh, that's a configuration, but truth be told, those configurations are a vulnerability, right? Go ahead.
It goes back to the definition. What's your definition of a vulnerability, right? What's your
how technical do we want to get into the difference between a weakness and a vulnerability?
Yeah, right. Flaw, weakness, vulnerability. It's like I've heard all of those terms like defined completely differently. But it really is your understanding and perspective of risk on your IT assets, your definition of a vulnerability on those IT assets, and you're willing to either do a couple of things with that risk on that IT asset. It's you accept that risk, so you're not going to do anything. You want to compensate that risk by adding compensating controls to somewhat mitigate that risk, or you deploy resources to remediate that risk completely. Get it out of your environment completely. But just going back to the whole vulnerability management, how that's continuously working, and how it's developed over the years. I started, my first internship was in a larger organization performing vulnerability management, where I would export scan results, look through a 1,000,000-line Excel file, and then try and work with the teams that were remediating the Unix, Linux systems and the Windows systems. It was just became, hey,
that people management process is like your job is basically to be annoying, right?
Yeah.
And everyone hates you. And how many conversations where people hate you are you really going to have in a week? Like, how many vulnerabilities can you really get done that way, right? How many can you remediate by annoying people? Like, how many people can you annoy in a day is really the question, right?
That's the KPI for Michael's internship job.
Yeah. You've probably seen this progression since then, Michael.
Yeah.
From 10 years ago, the standard was scan once a year.
Yeah.
And then it sort of moved towards maybe we should be scanning quarterly, right? Some people even recommended monthly. But then at some point, some years ago, the standards decided, wait, no, we need to actually define this. And it basically became, the recommendation basically became, well, you should be doing this quarterly. But not only should you be doing it quarterly, but you should start recording data about how effective your vulnerability detection is, and how effective your patch management is. And you'd look at those two numbers in terms of like, how many vulnerabilities did you detect and how many did you remediate and what was the average time to patch, right?
Yep.
And you try to like target an SLA, which is actually a big data exercise and it's quite difficult. However, it still doesn't work that well, because lots of stuff is hard to patch. You've got like half of the vulnerabilities in the CVE database, I believe, are like higher critical, which are the ones, like half of them. So if you got 30,000, that means you got 15,000 people you have to annoy. Like, how do you actually do that and maintain those? Like people get really excited when they detect 20,000 vulnerabilities and they remediate 20,000 vulnerabilities, and at any given day in a 90-day period they have like 10,000 open vulnerabilities, and they're like, look at all the work we did, right? But the reality is their doors were open for months. So just recently, the standards organizations have changed in the last few years, where now they're saying you need to have a practice put in place where you can scan, or usually the word is discover, right? Discover a vulnerability, decide what you're going to do about it, and then do the thing about it, which might be fix the thing, retire the thing, accept the risk. Maybe there's a technical exception, although we try to avoid those because they're not usually really technical exceptions. But and you have to do it all within either 14 days or 30 days from the time you discover it to the time you've decided what you're going to do about that thing. And because that's basically impossible to do for 15,000 vulnerabilities or whatever. They did throw us the bone, which is, oh, you get to prioritize, you get to set a risk acceptance threshold, and as long as you're prioritizing effectively based on risk, right, and you're going through that process and you're making risk-based acceptance decisions, you're satisfying the spirit, which was really interesting when the standards started making those changes a few years ago. But we didn't actually have a good way of prioritizing vulnerabilities, and people scrambled for a little while. But now we have this thing called EPSS, right, where it's actually really easy to target. So out of those 30,000 vulnerabilities, it might be only like 100 that really need to be above the noise floor, right? Maybe more than 100 out of 30,000, but it might only be like 200 or 300, right? And if you're keeping a clean shop, it's probably only a handful, right? And then all of a sudden you can treat it like an alarm system, right? Because if you clean it up and you really are discovering, you're making decisions, you're closing them out within a few days, that means, yeah, you've got all these open vulnerabilities, but you're using risk-based targeting. And I just use an acronym, and I should always define what we're talking about here, right, guys? Exploit prediction scoring system. We're looking at the vulnerabilities that people are actually using to break into systems, right? Those are the things we need to close up and have an SLA on, right? And that's vulnerability management, and it's continuous, right? In this penetration testing thing, it's like a totally different animal, I think, is what I'm hearing.
It is. Yeah. And I think you described the progression of vulnerability management over the last 10 years really well, where you now have to take that risk-based approach because a numbers game is not feasible. Going back to, one and the same, completely different between vulnerability management and pen tests. Just to touch on this, vulnerabilities are going to be discovered by your vulnerability management program and by your pen test. However, like we've talked about, like you probably understand at this point, it's different between doing that internally and then actually getting a third party to perform a lot of that exploitation, demonstrate the risk and impact. If a single vulnerability was exploited, what could an attacker get to within a network? What information could they touch? What's the impact for your business organization? So just testing that and evaluating if you're taking the correct risk-based approach when you're performing, that program, or if you're doing that program at all.
So you just pointed out a really important distinction here, and I think I'm understanding a really clean line of where to put things. So in vulnerability management, we're doing this sophisticated exercise. Hopefully we're doing daily scans, right? But we're discovering very frequently to find all these holes that people can break into. We're rating risk, and then we're shining that flashlight on the high risk things, and we're saying, oh, I have to fix you within 14 days, or in a couple standards, 30 days, right? Or I'm going to be outside of what the standard says I need to be doing. And you do that job, and you open the ticket, you annoy only one person that week, you get that job done, right? But basically you're just like, you're putting tape over the holes that keep opening in systems, right? Because you actually have to do that in IT, right? You don't have an option. And patch management's not enough, right? Because they're, as you alluded to earlier, they're not all things that you can patch.
Right.
So, but penetration testing and what you just described here was interesting to me, because what you're describing is the act of moving through a network or moving through multiple systems. And we use terms like escalation of privilege, right, and lateral movement to describe that way you move around through systems, right, and you hunt and you find the thing as an attacker that you're trying to impact, right? And that is that's why it's a human process, right? Because you're in there and you're exploring and you're actually looking for a thing and you can attack. And that sounds like a really clear distinction between penetration testing, which is like you're in there, like you're on a journey to break into these systems, you got into one thing, and then like, okay, what can I do? What other information can I find? Well, I got this piece of information, how can I use that to leverage and get this other piece of information, right? You're gaining all this information to add up to a result. With vulnerability management, we're just we're scanning and we're just closing up as many holes as we can, and not just on the outside, right? We're doing this everywhere, every place in the organization, because when the attackers in there and they're hunting around, you want to make sure every hallway and every door is solid, right?
Yeah. The other thing to point out too is that there's a lot of vulnerabilities that traditional scanners don't find. So you talk about misconfigurations and identities, and then the ways that you talked about the Privesc and the pivoting around. Those things are not something that traditional scanners find. Right?
So
Those are things.
This is what Brad's asking right now, right?
I love that.
Maybe
the
not
answer
every
is-
vector, but more vectors than a vulnerability scan, right?
I would say
Yeah.
more vectors. The thing about that is, one change in a user object, a computer object, could open a complete different attack path. Pen testing, we describe it as a point-in-time thing. An entirely new attack path could be chained together with 10 different vulnerabilities, however you describe that term, the next day after the pen test happens, right? Attributes get applied to user objects in a complex network every single day. So it's hard to evaluate every single possible attack path, there could be.
So, and it goes up exponentially as the bigger the environment is too, right?
Yeah,
so
exactly.
Like every addition, it's like, the math gets ridiculous on it.
So Jamie asked us, and it's been sitting here for a while because I didn't know how to answer it, but what types of varying pen tests are there? Unfortunately, I don't know that anyone even knows this answer. There's limitless, right, ways of making a computer system or an information system do something that it wasn't intended to do, right?
Yeah.
It's a creativity exercise, if nothing else. But then Dylan answered here. He names a few common ones, right? Dylan says his favorite one's social engineering. I wonder what he does with his spare time. But
you don't want to know. The way that we usually break it down in terms of conversations, and then we kind of go through in the back and kind of figure out how we would phrase it. But the way that we word it is traditionally external, internal, which is external internet facing assets, internal assumed breach, like assuming that someone's already in the environment, web application, mobile application, APIs, social engineering, and then the one that once you've done a number of those things and you have a secure a good program and everything like that, you've done pen tests, results have been fairly clean the last couple of years, then you move into what we call a red team. What is a red team? So it's more no rules, figure out how you can get in. And so hitting up someone on LinkedIn with a link that works for that company could be on the table potentially, depending on the rules of engagement.
So that's the term, just red teaming. We're using jargon, right? Generic-ish term, predates cyber, I believe. Comes from the military exercises. But the red team, I think some distinctions here in cybersecurity, right? One is it's usually more than one person, right?
Yep.
It's a team of people that usually come together with multiple skills. It would be, I think, unusual for a solid red team to not have someone that is really good at sneaking around in the dark, physically. Yeah. And then in addition to that, right, the fact that there's a team with varying disciplines, and also multiple parties that can do multiple things at the same time, right? It's not just about the skill set. There's usually a very defined goal, right? There's usually a flag to capture, I believe. So, what's a typical goal of a red team?
Ooh.
So what's the word?
Well, if someone goes out and buys red team, right, and what are they buying? What are they?
Okay, so if somebody went out and tried to buy a red team and hadn't done a pen test, I would advise them never to do a red team.
Oh yeah, they're gonna get owned in 15 minutes, right?
And it's gonna be expensive.
So, like you said, we work backwards from goals. So some typical goals could be gain access to the CEO's email. That's a goal. And then we work backwards into how do we, from the outside, sitting in Indianapolis, Indiana, target this executive down in Dallas, Texas, performing open
which
source.
might be getting on a plane.
Exactly.
There's yes, bringing a wireless antenna to the parking lot, bringing a little mini Raspberry Pi laptop there. Yeah,
but oftentimes it's really just breaking down all of the disciplines of a red team. So, how I would approach that is, maybe if I gain domain admin on their internal network, then it would be a lot easier for me just to kind of change his password and get into his O365 account, right? And so it's working backwards from those goals, finding specific attack paths. So red team's not going to find, every vulnerability in the books. It's not designed to. It's designed to test your resiliency against a sophisticated threat.
Right, and that's important to note. And whether it's a penetration test that has a narrow scope, right, or a red team, if it's not written on the engagement letter, it's not being found. And even if it was found, it's probably not going to make it to the report, right?
No.
So that's where the scope is important, right? But
Yes.
to presume that because someone did one of those tests that they're secure is quite a presumption when you look at the legislators that say, oh, you need to do a pen test, but they don't say what needs to be tested.
That is a great tie back to the original point. Yeah.
So you could scope, I don't know, anything.
Two external systems, and say we've had that happen with clients where we did a really big test, and the next year they were like, we realized that we just need to check the box, so we just want to do 1/10 of the scope.
And you asked me before we went live here, right, about SOC 2s, and I've actually read some SOC 2 reports that were scoped in a very interesting way to basically avoid all business systems, right? Like,
yeah, well,
they got that SOC 2 badge, but like they scanned
important.
something useless.
Yeah, it's important for people to understand that a SOC 2, it's a you create the scope. It's not, third party is testing the scope that you created. It's not, it's not a stamp of this is perfect security. So I think that's commonly misunderstood as well. That people like, where's your SOC 2 report? It's like, I don't think those really mean a ton sometimes, depending on how ethical the person is that's creating the scope. So, but yeah, no, that's a good point.
All right. Jamie already asked his question, but I'm going to pull another one because I get this question all the time. So basically, what do you tell someone who wants to become a pen tester? And as someone who does not consider themselves to be a pen tester, my usual answer is don't. For a few different reasons. One is I think the world has a bunch of pen testers, and yeah, it needs more of them, but it also needs more of all sorts of other things in cybersecurity, right? That are, but the other thing is, and this is, maybe you guys would agree or disagree with me, I think it's a tough labor market to, at low skill level, like at entry level, have like a clear career trajectory starting out in pen testing. I think that there's, first of all, we're in a global labor market right now, right? And so when you're looking at entry-level skill talent, you have to compete with everyone on the planet, right? And maybe that's good for a lot of people, but it's not good for everyone. And secondly, the real money in pen testing, right, is in those diverse, comprehensive scoped tests, right? And I would presume the recruiting requirements on those teams are not for entry-level talent, right?
Yeah, you got to be really into it yourself, practicing and stuff like that to get to that point. And it is, you're right, it'll be a stepping stone. You'll probably go work for one of those check the box organizations that's just going to run a scan, and you'll be more interested in them than them. You won't fit in that organization, so then you go find another one, then you kind of move your way up.
Yeah, but I do send people to capture the flag tournaments, right?
Yeah,
I send people to DEF CON. I think that our military and governments have some career options, right? I don't know, what other advice do we have for the next generation of pen testers?
I'm just going to tell like my background because I think it's a useful story and learning both sides of it. So I wasn't just hired into a pen test.
This is the background that Teddy hid.
That's right.
Teddy didn't know about this background.
Well, Teddy wanted me to, work straight for him, like right out of school. I didn't have the experience necessary to, straight up, after I got my degree, start technical security assessments for large Fortune 500 organizations. What helped me a lot, and we had lone staffing engagements where I worked on our clients' internal operations teams. I learned how to track and identify vulnerabilities on a continuous manner within applications, within systems, how organizations had internal processes to triage those, patch them. I got visibility into SOC operation or security operations centers where there were actually triaging real threat actors. With all of that knowledge, I was able to kind of learn and develop the skills that were necessary where I could then start to do some lower level engagements, understand, the threat landscape, attack surfaces for companies. And then you just kind of have to have the need to continuously research, continuously learn new techniques, because what I was doing back in 2018 doesn't work today. Like, it just doesn't, because new technology comes out, new, security controls are implemented, on a continuous basis for attacks that worked 5 years ago.
Well, wait. You just said something really important. I don't want to interrupt your story, but it's really important. You said new controls are being deployed and they're stopping attack patterns, and old attacks don't work. So for any of you that think you're secure because you engineered, you architected your security a few years ago, you should be deployed. This is why security is a process, right? Yep. Continuous deployment, right? No one should ever get to their security goal, in my opinion. You should have a long-term plan. When you get halfway there, you should set a new long-term plan.
It's what is Matthew McConaughey's thing in his book? I don't know if anyone's ever read that. His role model is himself in 5 years. I think I love that. I think that's all.
So Mike, you were telling us how your security operations center experience and really infrastructure management, that vulnerability management background positioned you for those low-level engagements, and then what, you got recruited to the big leagues, or the engagements just got more and more comprehensive?
Well, once I was doing those on one client or multiple clients, the vulnerability identification process kind of came naturally. And that's what you'll start out with in any pen testing lab, is how do you identify vulnerabilities and how do you demonstrate the risks of those vulnerabilities that matter? And then it's just a slow progression from there. And, if something has a CVSS 10 out of 10, right? Just because it has that score doesn't necessarily mean you're going to be able to exploit that on a penetration test, right? So.
All right, so the grind is the way there, I think, is what I heard.
There's no easy answer or no easy path.
Me and Zach are big fans of the grind.
The one thing I will say, though, that's like unmatched right now is, if you want to get into pen testing, the way to differentiate yourself is to understand risk and understand both sides of the table. Yes, pen testing is like a video game and breaking into things is awesome, but understanding the risk behind that is extremely important, where you can talk to a client about it. Because if you're just someone that can, hack into things and not really explain the real problem to it, that message is not going to get passed up to that executive.
So relate it back to their business.
Yeah.
If you can do that, then you're a good pen tester.
So we could go for hours on pen testing stories, and I've got some of my own, but I think we're out of time. So you guys want to do plugs?
Yeah. So Shield Cyber. Shield is so that's our vulnerability management platform. And we alluded to a little bit in the show about how traditional vulnerability management and vulnerability scanners don't necessarily find all the attack paths that attackers do. So what we did when we built this was we built a vulnerability management program with the idea of the vulnerabilities and the stuff that we find on a day-to-day basis. So it's taking that traditional, like you said, the oval, the definitions, the things that scan for vulnerabilities, but then it's actually contextualizing those things and using different attack paths and stuff like that to prioritize those things and find flaws that traditional scanners don't. We feel like our competitive advantage in that is that we, just being attackers ourselves, actually understand the vulnerabilities that matter. On top of EPSS and stuff like that, there's other things that don't have a CVE that can't be rated with a CVS with an EPSS score that we find that are very important to fix, and it lives in there all the time. So, Mike, what I missed?
That's it. We relate everything, and we do that by relating everything back to an asset, a user, or a group within your network. And then that does the contextualization piece. Helps you prioritize and make this not so much a numbers game.
Great. So Fort Mesa is in governance, risk, and compliance. For those of you that don't know, we've got a SaaS platform that helps service providers build up those security plans and make improvements over time. It also helps people right-size those security investments out of the client with QBR workflows. And I think that's it, guys. Zach, take us out of here.
All right, everyone. Thank you for joining us. This concludes another Friday at the MSP Cyber Roundtable. Be sure to like us on LinkedIn and subscribe to our YouTube for more educational content. Thanks so much to Teddy and Michael for joining us. Be sure to come back next week, where we're going to be welcoming Alex Farling and Wes Spencer from Empath Cyber to talk about adding cybersecurity to your QBRs. Have a great weekend, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.